So if you can just tell us your name and your date of birth for the titles.
Right, the name is Ian Harris, born 22nd of November 1915.
And the first thing I wanted to ask you about is about your own grandfather. What do you remember about him?
My maternal grandfather I never knew. My paternal grandfather, he came from, I think, Russia. He was quite a tall man, and I remember him particularly because he had a white goatee beard and also hair that was quite sort of stiff and close cropped and totally grey.
And where are you remembering him from?
And they lived in Adelina Grove, and this is a block of flats not very far from the London Hospital in the Whitechapel Road.
Right, and how come you're not sure where he came from?
Because never really made the positive inquiry. I think it was Russia because there was some kind of sort of internal family dissension between some members of the family who married into the family and who came from other parts. And there was always this kind of dissension between what I think were the Polish on the one hand and the Russian on the other, and I think my grandfather was the Russian one. Other parts of his family, who were Rabunim, they were named Rosenberg, but because of, I think, something to do with military service in the Russian army, when the eldest son either had to go into the army or was the one who need not go into the army, he changed his name. And though the family name was Rosenberg, his name, my grandfather's name, was Harris, because I think his Christian name was Hersch, and that became Harris, and that's how our family name became Harris. And that's why I think it was Russian, because I think it was the getting the eldest son out of the Russian army, which was the reason for a change of name.
And was the change of name of his own volition, or?
I have no idea.
Wasn't one of those things like, you know, at the port of entry?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think it was the Alphagessen. I don't think it was that type of name, or the Schneider name, or that kind of change of name. I think it arose out of this this eldest son and Russian army service that did it.
Right. And you had no memory whatsoever of the grandfather?
None at all. My maternal grandfather I never knew.
Was he dead before, when you were a baby?
I can tell you.
Yeah.
When did your mother get married?
1910 or something like that.
Before, after that?
I'm not sure about that.
Right.
Not sure about that.
I can't find this.
Right, but we'll find that for when you interview Nana, because of course it's also in her family.
Yes.
So she can give you that same information.
Right. And what about your grandmothers?
Can I just bring in once more into it? Your brother is named after him, so he was dead. That's why you didn't know.
My paternal grandmother was a very, I don't like to say nondescript, but she was the sort of woman that you didn't really notice. I remember her as small, mostly sitting at the table. I remember her making Lokshen in the good old-fashioned way. And that's about all.
And what was her name?
Her name was...
Martha.
She was a Martha.
And I don't think you told us the name of her husband.
Joseph.
He was Joseph, yes.
Right.
Joseph.
And so this was in Whitechapel that
This was in Whitechapel, yes.
And did you get out and about in that area when you went to visit?
Very much so. Very much so. It was a very, in those days, a common thing to visit grandparents. Although we lived at quite a distance.
Where were you living at the time?
We were living at that time, in the times I can remember, we were living in Becontree.
Right, which is in Essex, isn't it?
Which is in Essex, yes.
And what age are you that you're remembering your grandparents?
We're talking now about, I suppose, 6, 7 years old, I suppose, and onwards.
Right, so this is the early 20s then.
Mm-hmm, yep.
And what do you remember the East End like as the impressions? I mean, you were quite young. But...
well, I saw much more possibly of the East End life with another part of the family, with a maternal aunt who lived in New Road.
Where's that?
That's also Whitechapel. My aunt was a maternal aunt, and that's where my maternal grandfather originally lived, at 30 New Road.
This is the one that you can't remember?
That's right, this is the one I didn't know. My earliest memories there are of my uncle, who ran a tailoring business, which in fact was handed down from maternal grandfather.
Right.
And he was a very well-known man in the East End, both from a religion point of view and also from an employer point of view.
Right. And what was your uncle and aunt's name?
My uncle, they're married. My aunt's name was Katie. My uncle's name was Abraham, but we never knew him as Abraham. His surname was Rutman, and I never knew him as anything else other than Uncle Rut. And I never heard my aunt ever call him anything else but Rutman. Never by his Christian name, not ever.
So she called him Rut or Rutman?
Rutman or sometimes Rut, but mostly Rutman. But for us, he was always Uncle Rut.
And were there children in the house?
Yes, I had 3 cousins there. The eldest was named Joseph, after my maternal grandfather, and then there was Lionel and there was Jerry. Lionel has now passed on, but Joseph, we see he lives quite locally, and we see him on a fairly regular basis, and he is in fact 18 months older than I am.
And is he the one that was at your anniversary?
That's right, that's Joe.
Right.
That's right, that's him.
And what do you remember of the actual, of the environment outside the house? Were you allowed to go out and play?
Oh yes, I spent lots of time with them. I used to visit them quite regularly, and used to stay with them on weekends. And yes, I used to know all their friends. And youngest memories are of playing outside in the road with the good old game of marbles and flicking things at cardboard cigarette boxes, cigarette cards. We used to stand up against the wall and you flick nuts at them and knock them down and so on. And that was a regular outside game. And
you won the ones that you knocked over?
Well, I think it was how many you knocked over that was the important one there. But that's very occasionally, my father and my Uncle Rat were in fact very good friends. And on a Sunday, and this is when I got a bit older, on a Sunday we would go across to, he used to take us all across to Premierland for the boxing. So that was a great Sunday afternoon out.
Where was that?
This was just across the road in the
Commercial road?
in the commercial road. Yes, it was just New Road and across the road, and there you were in the Premierland.
And that's an indoor boxing venue.
And that was an indoor boxing venue, and that was in the good old days of Kid Berg and Ted Lewis, Kid Lewis. Those were the names that I knew.
Are these, is this amateur boxing?
No, these were professionals. These were professionals, and the amount of money that they got paid for actually boxing was very small indeed. But at the end of the fight, if the audience were happy with the boxing that they'd seen and the fight that they'd seen, they would throw money into the ring, and that was called noggins.
Noggins.
Noggins, yes.
And were there a lot of Jewish boxers then?
Yes, well, I say all the boxers, but almost all the boxers were Jewish young. Yeah. Yeah.
And was it a sort of a bit of an isolated scene, or was it just that the boxing circles were dominated by Jewish boxers at that time?
Well, I think perhaps it was an environmental thing. Perhaps, it was because it was a boxing community in a Jewish area, and also, of course, in those days, the Jewish clubs, of course, were very active. The Victoria Club and these clubs, they were very active indeed. And I think this also developed a generation of young Jewish boxers. But I mean, almost all of the champions of those days, certainly in the lighter weight classes, were all Jewish people like Kid Lewis, Kid Berg. You can go through them.
And the ones that weren't Jewish, what were they? Irish, black?
No idea. No idea. I don't think I ever saw a black boxer. Not ever.
Yeah. Apart from, I mean, in the East End at that time, obviously it was predominantly Jewish, but were there other minorities there at that time?
There were non-Jewish, but not the ethnic minorities that we know now. You wouldn't have seen, I don't think you would have seen a black face. I'll modify that at the moment. A black face amongst the residents, or in the sense that they were Caribbean or Indian, I don't think so. But there was a classic coloured man called Ras Prince Monolulu. Right. Now he used to stand opposite Gardener's Corner, and he used to hand out racing tips. Ras Prince Monolulu he used to be called, and everybody knew him.
And did they take up his tip?
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think he used to appear on the race courses as well. So he was the only black character that I ever knew in the.
What age was he at the time?
Even at those, I mean, to my young eyes, he was an elderly man, probably in his 40s, 50s, I would think. Yeah. But I think that anybody who knew the East End in those days, that would raise a memory. Everybody knew him.
Yeah, and I mean,
I got an horse, he used to call. I got an horse.
And were you conscious of being near the port at all? Did that have any impact?
No. The dock area was a good bit farther down the road, Poplar. And that was almost at the limit of what you might call the Jewish area. That would have been a non-Jewish area, but not an area that I knew. Not at that time.
Did you ever go down to the docks?
Not as a youngster, but a bit later on, because there used to be a wonderful Chinese restaurant in Poplar that we used to go to, called the Good Earth.
Friends, wasn't it?
What was it?
Friends.
Good Friends, that's right. The Good Friends, and that was.
This was after you were married.
That was our first sort of meet up with Chinese cooking, yeah, and that was an outing.
Was that a rare phenomenon then in those days?
It was to us. Yeah, that was definite novelty for me. A Chinese restaurant, because there certainly wasn't one in the area that that we lived in, not in Becontree, not anything like that.
What year was it you got married in?
38.
1938.
So you're talking about the late 30s here then?
Yep.
To visit there.
Yeah. Yep.
And tell me a bit about Becontree, because I don't know anything about that.
Becontree, in those days, the LCC was a very powerful organisation, and of course ran so many things, including housing estates. There was one at Tottenham, there was one out at Morden, and in the early 20s, I would think it probably started about 1918, 1919, and gradually came to fruition in the very early 20s. We lived in Stoke Newington at that time.
Before going to Becontree?
Before going to Becontree, and then moved to Becontree, and I would think it was 1920 or 1921.
Right. Can I just jump in there for a second? And so you're about 5 or 6 at that point. Do you remember anything about Stoke Newington?
Yes, yes. We lived at 2 addresses in Stoke Newington. One was called 22 Norcott Road. And I remember that, I think, for 2 reasons. Firstly, because I got mumps on my birthday, I think it was, at 22 Norcott Road, and I was to be, what, 4 or 5? I was 4, maybe, 3 or 4. And the other, we moved from Norcott Road to Church Street. Church Street also in Stoke Newington, and I can remember that because we lived in a flat above a shop, and the shop was almost at the entrance to the local cemetery. So my memories of Church Street really are more the cemetery than they are the house itself, because that was the main environment. But I started school in Church Street and went across, I suppose, at 5.
So did you play in the cemetery?
Not that I can remember, no.
But you could see it from the house?
Yeah, well, you looked out the back of the windows and there it was.
So that's, if you're going down Church Street into Stoke Newington High Street, it's on the left-hand side, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
And where, relative to if you're looking at the cemetery from Church Street, was it to the left or the right of the entrance where you lived?
I think it was to the right. If you were going into the entrance, I think it must have been off to the right.
Right. And what do you remember much about this Stoke Newington area at the time? Was it very predominantly Jewish as well? Oh,
still, yes, 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 it was. The whole area was beginning to be, because the first move out from the East End was towards Stoke Newington, Hackney, and then out to Stamford Hill. That was the direction of the migration. Right. And then from Stamford Hill, of course, then it came out. You came out to Golders Green and that area. Right. But that was the direction of the migration from the East End.
And what about the move to Essex? Was that common as well?
No, no, not at all. I think, given the choice, most people who were offered accommodation in LCC housing from the East End would have gone to Tottenham, because that also was beginning to be a Jewish area. Why we came to Becontree, I really wouldn't know.
What was it like, Becontree?
Becontree was the main abode of Ford workers.
So was it very built up, or was it still in the country?
No, it was very much a housing estate in the best possible, in the best possible arrangement. I mean, it was all nice and wide open, plenty of playing space, park areas, and so on. When we first got there, it was in a very not at all advanced state of construction, And in fact, at the back of our house, there was a railway which ran the whole length of what was known as Becontree Avenue, and that fed the building situation. The trains used to fetch in all the building materials and carry away all the old stuff, and we could actually walk out of the back of our garden across the railway and then across into a park. So. And then to the local railway station, which was quite a way away actually. We weren't blessed with transport, you know. If you wanted to get anywhere, you had to, you had to work at it. My father worked in the East End.
As?
He was a wood carver. He was a wood carver. Worked in the furniture trade as a wood carver.
So was he carving sort of the details on furniture?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, this was a classic example of the work that he did. Now he would start his journey. He would leave the house at 6 o'clock in the morning in order to get to work at 8 o'clock. But there was a further motive, of course, that if you got the train before, I think it was 7 o'clock, you got a workman's ticket. So his fare from Goodmayes, which was at our local station, to Liverpool Street, which was the end of the line, I think would have been about 8 or 9 old pence. That was his workman's fare.
And what sort of age was he at this point when you said he was back?
Oh.
So it's about 19, just early 20s, isn't it?
Early 20s, he would have been, what, 30, I suppose. He was born.
Do you remember what?
He was born in the late 80s, I think, something like 1888 or something like that. So he would have been then about in his early 30s, I would think. Yeah, in his early 30s.
And when did Henry arrive?
1921.
Right, so
he came to Becontree as a baby. I did have an older brother,
right,
who was also a Joseph,
right,
and in fact was contemporary with my cousin Joseph, and he also was named after my maternal grandfather. He died at approximately, I think, around about the 2-year-old, I think.
Right. When was that?
Well, that would have been about 1915.
So you don't remember him at all?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Sometimes I think I have memories, but we went off to Pinner during the First World War. That was our safe area.
Was that the whole family?
Yes, my father was in the army, so it was just myself and my mother, I suppose. And I do have a very vague recollection of my father. I think I was in my cot, and I have a vague recollection of my father in uniform coming in to see me. So I could only have been 2 years old, 18 months, 2 years old, and I don't have a recollection of my brother, not ever.
No. And did he die of a childhood illness?
Yes, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what he died of, but he was very definitely a childhood illness.
Did it have a big impact on your mum?
I think it did. I think it did. Because by the time I was in my early, it was, as long as I can remember, she had a hearing problem. She had a hearing difficulty. By the time I was mid-teens, she was in fact totally deaf, with a nerve deafness, and I would not be at all surprised if that wasn't, some of that didn't come out of the loss of the child.
So when you say nerve deafness, it wasn't a purely physical thing?
Well, no, it was always described as nerve deafness. So I suppose that meant that the you know, the engineering was okay, but the you know, that the sensory part was deficient.
Right. And yeah, and so your dad, did he go to France during the war?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Where did he serve? Do you know?
He served in France, and he was, I'm not sure, the regiment. I think he was a fighting soldier, yeah, but he was in France.
And did he was he conscripted, or did he join out?
I've no idea. I have no idea. I've got his army papers somewhere, but I don't think that says anything.
So if he joined at the beginning of the war, he would have been just in his late 20s.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Relatively
Did he ever
young.
talk
Yeah.
about it afterwards?
No. I never heard my father discuss his army experiences at all. The only exception was that he suffered very badly from bunions, and he complained, and he reckoned that was entirely due to army boots and marching. But that was the only thing that ever happened to him.
So he never gave you any kind of indication whether it had been a
Not ever.
traumatic time?
Not ever. I've never heard him discuss his army experiences.
And did he have friends from the army at all?
No, not that I can remember. Not that I can remember. I mean, we have photographs here, there and everywhere, or did have, you know, of uncles in uniform and so on. But they were just the normal pictures that, you know, got handed around. So, I mean, a lot of the family were in the forces.
And by the time...
I can't ever remember anybody talking about them.
That's funny, isn't it? And presumably by the time of the next war, he was too old to...
Yes, in what you call it, in the next war, because of the industrial situation, of course, from the early 1930s, people were, you know, falling out of work, right, left and centre, and it was a very, you know, it was a very difficult period. He, I think, probably finished work as such, his trade work as such, in the early, I would think in the early 30s, and he never had another job, not as a wood carver, not in the furniture, but until I think until the wartime, when they, you know, you were doing building work and repair work and that kind of work.
So he was in employment until the early 30s.
Yes.
For other people's companies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then all through the 30s, what he just did sporadic bouts.
Yes, whatever. Yeah.
Whatever he could.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then during the war, he was able to work.
Yes, then they went back into employment as such, but doing the necessary war jobs. Yeah.
And then what happened after the war, work-wise?
He retired. I can't ever remember. He went back. He did have some. He did work. He did some post-war work, but not as a wood carver. I don't think he did. He did some furniture work, some jobs. But of course, by the time the war was over, he would have been, you know, he would have been in his 50s, and yeah.
So by the end of the war, he was almost retirement age.
Yes, I mean, they just got jobs where he, you know, where he goes.
Right. And what was I going to ask you about? Oh yeah, I mean, I'm just going to skip something totally different, but it's just something that that I'm intrigued about, really, to do with the war. But from your memory, when was the first time you were conscious of the Holocaust or of the concentration camps? Or anything?
Not at all. Not at all.
Until after the war?
Until after the war. Not an inkling.
I'm just going to ask Nana off camera, was it the same for you?
At 15 years old, I said to my mother, "What am I?" "What do you mean, what are you?" "What am I? I don't understand you." "Am I English?" "Of course you are. I'm bred and born English," says my mother. I said, "No, I'm a Jew," because Hitler made me realise. I was very conscious, and my mother used to...
When you were 15? And when would that have been then?
1931.
1931. So you were conscious of the of what was going on in Germany even as early as the early 30s. Right. Okay, I'll have to talk to you about that separately.
Yep.
So it's you had no inkling of...
Not at all.
And so when did you first learn about it? Was it from newsreels or something?
Yes, I suppose the first that you really knew about it was I suppose really it was the Jews and Israel, I suppose, or Jews and Palestine. I think that was the first time you were conscious that Jews had to leave their homes and go to a new home.
Are you talking about post-war here?
Now we're talking post-war. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you were conscious of it in what way? That there were actually people leaving London that
yes.
you knew to go to
I suppose, looking back, probably the biggest, I suppose, was the story of the Exodus.
Right. The Exodus ship.
Yes, I suppose that was the biggest.
So sorry, go on, finish it.
Yeah.
So you didn't see any images of the liberation of the concentration camps or anything?
Nothing at all.
Is that
nothing
because
at all.
You didn't go? Did you go to the movies then, or?
Well, yes. We did.
Was it just not shown very confidently?
I can't ever remember. I cannot ever remember seeing on the screen. I cannot ever remember seeing on the screen anything to do with anti-Semitism or to do with the aftermath of the war in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of persecution of Jews, in terms of exodus of Jews from the continent.
So, not even magazines or newspapers?
Shouldn't think he had time to read them.
Not that I can remember.
Right.
Not
so
that I can remember.
It wasn't a big topic of discussion amongst the Jewish community here?
No, Becontree was a very sort of well-rounded Jewish community. There were only 100 families altogether on the whole estate.
Right.
I never encountered any anti-Semitism. I never encountered any anti-Semitism. The only anti-Semitism that I ever encountered